There are moments in a seeker's life when ordinary remembrance stops feeling ordinary, when repetition of sacred words is no longer about reward or habit, but about something deeper trying to break through the noise inside the chest. In the writings attributed to Ibn Arabi, remembrance is not treated as a mechanical act. It is described as a transformation of perception itself, not that the words change, but the one who repeats them begins to dissolve. What people later call a secret dhikr is not a hidden formula. It is a condition of the heart that emerges when remembrance is no longer done with the tongue alone, but with the total surrender of the inner being over time. The claim that the heart opens in 21 days should not be taken as a promise of timing, but as a symbolic threshold, a period in which persistence breaks resistance and repetition turns into unveiling. What follows is not instruction for magic results, but a reflection in the spirit of Ibn Arabi on how remembrance reshapes the human soul when it is practiced with sincerity, presence, and inner submission. In the perspective of Ibn Arabi, the first veil between the human being and spiritual awareness is not ignorance of knowledge, but distraction of presence. This is a crucial shift in understanding, because most people assume the problem is not knowing enough. In reality, the deeper problem is that even when we know, we are rarely fully there for what we know. The tongue may remember, yet the heart remains elsewhere, scattered across worries, memories, desires, fears, and imagined futures. So the act of remembrance becomes divided. One part of the human is saying the words, while another part is living somewhere else entirely. True dhikr begins when the one who remembers realizes that they are not fully present in their own remembering. This is not a small realization, it is a turning point in inner life, because up until that moment, a person assumes that repetition alone is enough. But when awareness awakens, you begin to notice something uncomfortable yet deeply important. You are physically present, but internally absent. You are speaking, but not fully listening. You are repeating, but not fully witnessing. Ibn Arabi would describe this as the first unveiling of truth, not about the divine yet, but about yourself. This realization is not discouraging. It is the beginning of awakening. It may feel like a failure at first, but it is actually a form of clarity. For when you see your absence, you begin to seek presence, and seeking presence is the real beginning of the path. Without this recognition, a person can repeat sacred words for years and remain unchanged inwardly because they never truly entered the act they were performing. But once awareness enters, even a single moment of genuine presence becomes more valuable than long periods of mechanical repetition. In the early stage of consistent remembrance, the seeker often feels nothing changing externally. Life continues as it was. Problems remain. Emotions fluctuate. The world does not suddenly respond differently. This is where many people lose patience. They expect visible transformation quickly, but Ibn Arabi's perspective does not support the idea of instant external results. Instead, he points toward invisible internal rearrangement that happens beneath perception. At first, the change is so subtle that it is almost impossible to describe. It is not an emotion, it is not excitement, it is not even peace in the beginning. It is something quieter than all of these. It is the simple fact that attention starts to notice itself more often. You catch yourself drifting, and you return, then drifting again and returning again. This cycle, repeated over time, begins to reshape the structure of awareness itself. The scattered nature of attention starts to gather. Imagine your mind as light spread in many directions, constantly pulled outward by noise, distraction, and internal dialogue. Through consistent remembrance, that scattered light slowly begins to bend inward, not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually. Moments of stillness begin to appear in between thoughts. Small gaps open in the constant mental movement. At first, they are brief and easily missed, but they are important, because they are signs that attention is learning how to return. The fragmented self slowly begins to face inward instead of outward. This is not a poetic idea only. It is an experiential shift. Normally, human awareness is oriented outward, always reacting to what is seen, heard, remembered, or imagined. But through remembrance, something reverses. The direction of attention begins to soften its dependence on external stimulation. You start noticing that even without external input, something inside remains aware. This is the beginning of inner stability. Ibn Arabi describes this process as the return of the scattered rays of consciousness back to their source. This metaphor is important. It suggests that nothing new is being added to the human being. Instead, something is being collected, gathered, and returned to its origin. In this sense, remembrance is not acquisition, it is reintegration. You are not becoming something else. You are becoming less divided. In practical terms, this means that repetition is not the goal, presence is. This distinction is where most seekers misunderstand the path. They think more repetition automatically means more progress, but Ibn Arabi's view shifts the emphasis completely. Repetition without awareness is like walking in circles without noticing the direction. It may create effort, but not transformation. Presence, even in small amounts, changes the quality of repetition itself. Without presence, even thousands of repetitions remain on the surface. They touch the tongue, maybe even the mind, but not the deeper layers of being. They pass through you like words passing through an empty space. There is movement, but no imprint. There is sound, but no depth. And over time, this creates frustration, because effort does not match inner change. With presence, even a few moments of remembrance can feel like entering a different dimension of awareness. Something shifts in how you experience yourself. Time feels different. The mind slows down, not because it is forced, but because it is no longer fully dominant. There is a sense that you are not just thinking or repeating, but witnessing your own existence from a deeper place. And this is the key insight of Ibn Arabi's approach to Dhikr. The transformation is not in the words, but in the one who becomes aware while speaking them. The secret is not hidden in complexity, but in attention. The entire journey begins when you stop assuming you are already fully present and start recognizing how often you are not. From that recognition, sincerity begins to grow, and from sincerity, presence begins to deepen. And from presence, everything else slowly starts to reorganize itself. In Ibn Arabi's perspective, once the seeker begins to recognize the problem of distraction, a deeper and more subtle truth starts to emerge. It is not enough to simply notice that the mind is absent. The next realization is even more confronting. You are not the one producing remembrance in the way you think you are. This sounds strange at first, but it changes everything about how dhikr is understood and practiced. Most people approach remembrance with the assumption that they are the active doer. I am remembering. I am repeating. I am trying to stay focused. But Ibn Arabi shifts this entirely. He suggests that remembrance is not something you manufacture through effort alone. Instead, it is something that becomes possible when certain inner conditions are purified enough to allow it. In other words, you are not forcing remembrance into existence. You are removing what prevents it from naturally arising. This changes the entire emotional pressure of the practice. Because when you believe you are the sole producer of remembrance, every distraction feels like personal failure. Every lapse feels like weakness. Every moment of inattentiveness feels like you are losing progress. But in Ibn Arabi's framing, these are not failures of production. They are signals of remaining veils. You are not breaking dhikr. You are observing where attention is still bound. In this view, dhikr becomes a process of subtraction rather than addition. This is one of the most important hidden principles in his spiritual understanding. The human being is already connected at the deepest level. The issue is not absence of connection, but layers of interference that block awareness of it. So the work is not to create closeness, but to remove forgetfulness, not to add presence, but to uncover what is already present beneath noise. As the seeker continues consistent remembrance, especially in a disciplined daily rhythm, something subtle begins to happen in perception. The mind does not become instantly quiet, but it becomes less convincing. Thoughts still arise, but they begin to lose authority. They appear less like commands and more like passing weather. This is a critical shift, because earlier, every thought felt important, urgent, or defining. Now they start to feel temporary. Ibn Arabi would describe this as the weakening of dominance of mental forms over the heart. The heart, in his understanding, is not the physical organ, but the center of perception and awareness. When the heart is covered, the mind dominates completely. But when remembrance is consistent, even if imperfect, the heart begins to regain its natural clarity. It does not fight thoughts. It simply stops being ruled by them. At this stage, the seeker may not notice dramatic spiritual experiences. In fact, externally, nothing may look different at all, but internally, the relationship with thoughts is changing. You begin to notice space between thought and reaction. A thought arises, but you are not immediately pulled into it. There is a moment of pause, even if small. In that pause, awareness becomes visible. This is where Ibn Arabi's idea of removal of forgetfulness becomes experiential. Forgetfulness is not just not remembering the divine, it is being fully absorbed in whatever appears in consciousness without awareness of its passing nature. When remembrance strengthens even slightly, this absorption begins to loosen. You still think, feel, react, but you are less completely merged with it. Over time, through repetition supported by sincerity, the inner noise begins to lose density. It does not disappear completely. That is not the point. Instead, it becomes transparent. You begin to sense that beneath the movement of thoughts, something unchanging is present. This is not an idea you believe. It is something you notice directly in quiet moments. Ibn Arabi frames this transformation as returning awareness to its source, but not in a distant metaphysical sense. It is immediate and intimate. The source is not somewhere else. It is the underlying awareness that is always already here before any thought appears. The problem is not that you are far from it, but that you are constantly distracted from noticing it. This is why effort alone cannot complete the process. If effort creates more tension, it can actually increase inner fragmentation. What is needed is consistent return without obsession. A rhythm of remembrance that is steady, not forced. In this rhythm, something paradoxical happens. The more you stop trying to control every moment of the practice, the more stable the awareness becomes. Another important shift happens here. The seeker begins to understand that progress is not linear. There are days of clarity and days of heaviness, days where presence feels natural, and days where distraction dominates again. Ibn Arabi would not interpret this as regression. Instead, he would see it as layers of conditioning rising and dissolving in cycles. The key is not to evaluate yourself based on temporary states, but to continue returning regardless of state. Because every return, even after distraction, strengthens the underlying orientation of the heart. Even forgetfulness becomes part of the purification process when followed by sincere return. Eventually, something very subtle begins to form. A stable inclination toward remembrance, even in the middle of life. Not forced focus, but natural tendency. The heart begins to lean back toward awareness, even when the mind is engaged elsewhere. This is the beginning of integration, not separation between spiritual practice and daily life, but gradual merging of both into one continuous awareness. In Ibn Arabi's vision, this is the real meaning of dhikr, becoming alive. Not that you are always repeating words, but that awareness itself begins to remember, even when words are absent, and that shift does not come from intensity alone. It comes from repeated removal of what blocks clarity, until remembrance is no longer something you do, but something that begins to do you. In Ibn Arabi's perspective, once the seeker begins to understand that dhikr is not about mechanical repetition, but about uncovering presence, a deeper truth begins to surface that completely changes how the heart is understood. The heart is not a passive receiver of spiritual experience. It is an active mirror, constantly reflecting whatever is placed before it. But most people never realize what they are continuously placing in front of it. At first, the seeker assumes the heart is either pure or blocked, as if it is a fixed state. But Ibn Arabi's view is far more dynamic. The heart is constantly being shaped moment by attention. Whatever you repeatedly give attention to becomes the dominant reflection in your inner mirror. This means the quality of your remembrance is not just about the words you say, but about what your awareness is facing while you say them. When the heart is turned outward all the time, it becomes overloaded with images, memories, emotional reactions, and imagined futures. These do not just stay in the mind, they settle into perception itself. Over time, the heart becomes clouded, not because it is broken, but because it is constantly reflecting too many things at once. This is what Ibn Arabi refers to as veiling through multiplicity. Not a single block, but endless interference. Now, when dhikr begins, especially when done consistently, something very subtle starts to happen. The direction of attention begins to shift. At first, it still swings outward constantly. You sit to remember, and almost immediately the mind pulls you into thoughts about work, people, problems, or memories. But every time you return, even briefly, you are changing the orientation of the heart. This return is more important than most people realize, because each return is not just a repetition of words, it is a reorientation of the mirror. You are turning the heart away from fragmentation and back toward unity, even if only for a moment. Ibn Arabi would say that the heart is being polished not by perfection, but by consistent redirection. At the beginning, this polishing is invisible. The seeker feels like nothing is happening. The same distractions appear, the same thoughts return, the same restlessness continues. But underneath this surface movement, something deeper is slowly forming. The heart is learning a new habit, the habit of returning. And this habit, over time, becomes more powerful than the distractions themselves. Ibn Arabi describes the heart as a mirror that does not reject images, but reflects them according to its state. When the mirror is clouded, every reflection appears distorted. When it is polished, even ordinary reality appears different. This does not mean the external world changes. It means perception itself becomes clearer, less filtered through emotional and mental distortion. As Dhikr continues, something very important begins to happen inside the seeker's awareness. Moments of clarity start to appear unexpectedly, not during intense effort, but often in silence, in ordinary activity, or even in brief pauses between thoughts. These moments are not dramatic. They are simple, almost fragile, but unmistakable. In those moments, the mind is still, and the heart feels unburdened by its usual noise. This is what Ibn Arabi would describe as flashes of unveiling. Not full revelation, not permanent transformation, but brief removals of veils that allow the seeker to see reality without distortion. These glimpses are not the goal, but they are signs that the direction is correct. They show that the mirror is beginning to respond to polishing. However, a critical misunderstanding often arises here. The seeker begins to chase these moments. They want more clarity, more peace, more silence. But Ibn Arabi's framework warns against this subtle trap. Because the moment you start chasing experiences, you return to outward orientation again. You shift from presence to expectation, from witnessing to desire. The real progress is not in the intensity of these glimpses, but in the stability of return. Can you come back after distraction without frustration? Can you continue without measuring progress every moment? Can you remain consistent even when nothing feels special? These questions define the depth of transformation far more than any temporary experience. Over time, something very quiet but powerful begins to develop. The heart starts to remain slightly more stable, even in the middle of daily life. You are no longer completely absorbed by every thought or emotion that appears. There is a growing sense that behind all movement, something within you is not moving at the same speed. This is the beginning of what Ibn Arabi would consider true inner alignment. Not escape from the world, not rejection of thought, but the emergence of a center that is less affected by constant fluctuation. The heart begins to function less like a reacting surface and more like a witnessing depth. And in this shift, Dhikr stops being just a practice you perform at specific times. It starts to influence how you experience everything, not because life changes, but because the mirror through which life is seen is slowly becoming clearer. The same world is there, but it is no longer completely overwhelming. What begins as repetition slowly becomes refinement of perception, and what begins as effort slowly becomes a return to something already present beneath effort. This is why Ibn Arabi emphasizes that the real work is not to force transformation, but to consistently remove what distorts what is already true. In this stage, the seeker starts to understand something quietly profound. The heart was never meant to become something else. It was meant to become clear enough to reflect what it already is. In Ibn Arabi's perspective, there comes a stage in the seeker's journey where the struggle with distraction begins to change form. It does not disappear, but it becomes less chaotic, less overwhelming, and more revealing. At this point, something very important becomes clear. The problem was never just the presence of thoughts or distractions, but the relationship you have with them. And that relationship is slowly being restructured through consistent remembrance. At first, Dhikr feels like an act performed against resistance. You sit to remember, and immediately you feel pulled away. You try to stay present, and the mind resists. This creates an inner conflict that most people interpret as failure. But Ibn Arabi's view reframes this entirely. He suggests that this resistance is not an obstacle to the path, it is part of the path itself. Because without resistance, there would be nothing for awareness to refine. Over time, through repetition, something shifts in how resistance is experienced. It is no longer as sharp or as personal. Earlier, distraction felt like defeat. Now it begins to feel like movement within awareness. Thoughts still arise, but they are less capable of fully capturing you. You begin to notice that you are not inside every thought that appears. Some thoughts pass through without pulling you completely into their story. This is where Ibn Arabi's idea of time becomes essential. He does not treat spiritual transformation as a simple linear progression, where each day is strictly better than the last. Instead, he sees it as a layered unfolding. The seeker moves through phases that often overlap, repeat, and deepen in cycles. Progress is not a straight line upward. It is more like waves that gradually change their depth and rhythm. In this sense, the idea of 21 days should not be misunderstood as a strict spiritual deadline. It is symbolic. It represents the point where repetition begins to affect the structure of attention itself. Not because time has magical properties, but because sustained focus over a period begins to weaken old patterns of fragmentation. The first phase is resistance. In this phase, the ego strongly asserts itself. It questions the practice, distracts the mind, delays consistency, and creates excuses. The seeker often feels heavy, inconsistent, or mentally scattered. Ibn Arabi would say this is the surface layer of consciousness reacting to change. It does not yet understand what is happening, so it resists. The second phase is adaptation. In this stage, the practice becomes more familiar. The resistance is still there, but it is less intense. The seeker begins to establish rhythm. Remembrance becomes part of routine, even if it still feels mechanical at times. This is a critical phase because many people stop here thinking nothing deeper is happening. But Ibn Arabi would say this is where the real internal conditioning begins. The third phase is subtle integration. This is where something very important starts to happen quietly. Remembrance begins to extend beyond the moments when you are consciously performing it. You start noticing traces of awareness during ordinary activities, not continuous presence, but spontaneous returns to awareness. Small moments where the mind pauses and the heart feels slightly more awake. This is not yet stability, but it is no longer pure effort either. It is a transitional state where Dhikr starts to move from being an action into becoming a background state of awareness. You are still actively remembering, but something in you is also beginning to remain slightly aware even when you are not consciously focused. Ibn Arabi would describe this as remembrance descending from the level of effort into the level of presence. In simpler terms, what was once something you did is now beginning to affect how you are, even outside of doing it. This is a major shift because it means transformation is no longer limited to practice sessions. It is starting to touch perception itself. At this stage, something very subtle but powerful becomes noticeable. The mind still produces thoughts, but their grip weakens further. You can observe them more easily without immediately identifying with them. There is a small but growing gap between awareness and reaction. In that gap, a different kind of clarity becomes available. Time itself begins to feel different, not externally, but internally. Moments of awareness feel slightly expanded, while moments of distraction feel slightly compressed. This is not physical time changing, but experiential time shifting. Ibn Arabi would interpret this as a sign that attention is no longer fully bound to mental movement. Another important shift happens here. The seeker begins to realize that consistency matters more than intensity. There may be days of strong focus and days of weakness, but the deeper pattern is continuity. Even when presence feels low, the act of returning continues. And that return itself becomes the real anchor of transformation. This is where many misunderstand the path. They think spiritual progress should feel constantly uplifting or increasingly peaceful, but Ibn Arabi's perspective is more grounded. He would say the real sign of progress is not constant elevation, but reduced identification with fluctuation. You are no longer completely defined by your internal weather. In this phase, the seeker may still experience strong distractions, emotional turbulence, or mental noise. But something underneath all of that remains slightly steadier. It is not immunity to disturbance, but a growing ability to observe disturbance without complete collapse into it. This is the beginning of what could be called inner stability. Not perfection, not silence, but stability of return. No matter how far the mind drifts, there is a growing tendency to come back, and that return becomes faster, more natural, less forced. Ibn Arabi would emphasize that this is not achieved through struggle alone, but through sustained familiarity with remembrance. The heart becomes accustomed to returning, just as the body becomes accustomed to walking. At first, every step requires effort. Later, movement becomes natural, and so what began as fragmented practice slowly begins to resemble a continuous inner orientation. Not because distractions have vanished, but because they no longer fully define the center of awareness. The seeker is no longer entirely inside thought, nor entirely outside it. Instead, a quiet witnessing presence begins to stabilize beneath both. In Ibn Arabi's perspective, there comes a turning point in the practice of dhikr, where the seeker begins to see a very uncomfortable truth about themselves. It is not that they lack discipline, it is not that they are incapable of remembrance, it is that they are constantly interrupted by something deeper than distraction itself, and that something is identity. At first, the seeker believes the main obstacle is the wandering mind. So the focus is placed on controlling thoughts, forcing attention, trying harder to stay present. But over time, through consistent remembrance, a more subtle realization begins to emerge. The problem is not just what you think, but the deeper sense of I that reacts to every thought. Ibn Arabi would describe this as the hidden structure of the ego, not as a single entity, but as a pattern of identification. Every thought that arises is quickly claimed by an inner sense of ownership. This is my thought. This is my emotion. This is my distraction. And in that ownership, the seeker becomes entangled again and again. As Dhikr continues, something begins to shift in this structure. Not suddenly, and not dramatically, but gradually and almost invisibly. The seeker starts to notice that thoughts arise on their own, without permission. Emotions appear without invitation. Memories surface without warning, and yet the I that claims them is not as stable as it once appeared. This is where Ibn Arabi's insight becomes very deep. He suggests that what you call yourself is not a fixed entity, but a continuous process of identification, and dhikr, when practiced consistently, begins to interrupt this automatic identification, not by destroying the self, but by revealing its constructed nature. At this stage, the seeker may experience something unsettling. During remembrance, there are moments when thoughts continue, emotions continue, even mental noise continues, but the sense of ownership over them slightly weakens. It feels as if experience is happening, but the grip of "this is me" is loosening. This is not dissociation in a psychological sense. It is clarity of observation. You are not losing awareness of yourself. You are losing false certainty about what the self actually is. And this creates a strange but important space inside consciousness. A space where experience is present, but less personalized. Ibn Arabi would describe this as the beginning of witnessing. Not witnessing as a technique, but witnessing as a natural state that appears when identification weakens. In this state, the seeker begins to notice that awareness is constant, but what it is aware of is constantly changing. Thoughts come and go, emotions rise and fall, sensations appear and dissolve, but awareness itself remains unchanged in its ability to observe all of it. And when dhikr is added to this observation, something stabilizes in a very subtle way. Not control, but clarity. The seeker begins to realize that struggle with distraction was often fueled by resistance to experience itself. Trying to eliminate thoughts creates tension. Trying to fight emotions strengthens their presence. But when remembrance becomes steady and observation becomes more mature, there is less fighting and more noticing. This does not mean the mind becomes silent. In fact, in many cases, thoughts may still be very active, but their power changes. They no longer define the entire field of awareness. They become events within awareness rather than the center of it. At this point, Ibn Arabi would say the heart begins to experience a different relationship with existence. Instead of being fully absorbed in every mental event, it begins to stand slightly apart, not in separation, but in clarity. You are still experiencing life fully, but you are no longer completely consumed by every internal movement. This is where the illusion of complete personal control begins to weaken. The seeker starts to see that much of what they assumed was them is actually happening on its own. Thoughts arise on their own. Emotions shift on their own. Even the sense of effort appears and disappears without full control. This realization can initially feel destabilizing, because the ego is built on the assumption of control. But Ibn Arabi would not interpret this as loss. He would interpret it as correction. A correction of false ownership, where experience is no longer falsely attributed to a rigid self. As Dhikr continues, something very important happens inside this space. The act of remembrance begins to feel less like something the individual is doing, and more like something awareness itself is allowing. There is still participation, but it feels less forced, less authored by a separate doer. This is a crucial shift, because earlier stages of practice are dominated by effort. You are trying to remember. You are trying to stay present. You are trying to improve. But in this stage, effort begins to soften. Not disappear, but become less central. And in its place, a quieter continuity begins to emerge. The seeker starts to notice that remembrance sometimes continues even without strong effort. Not constantly, not perfectly, but in moments where awareness feels naturally aligned. In those moments, Dhikr is not performed, it is simply present. Ibn Arabi would see this as a sign that remembrance is moving from action to realization, from something done by the self to something revealing what the self actually is. And what it reveals is not emptiness or disappearance, but a more fundamental layer of awareness that was always present beneath identification. At this stage, the seeker may still experience confusion, doubt, and fluctuation. But something irreversible has begun. The belief in a completely solid, separate, controlling self has started to loosen. And in that loosening, awareness becomes less burdened, less reactive, and more transparent. This is why Ibn Arabi emphasizes that true transformation is not about becoming someone new. It is about seeing through what was never fully real in the first place. And dhikr, when sustained, becomes the quiet force that gradually dissolves the illusion of separation, not through force, but through continuous, patient clarity. In Ibn Arabi's perspective, there comes a stage in the seeker's inner journey where the most important battle is no longer with distraction, thoughts, or even identification with the self. It becomes something far more subtle and far more difficult to notice. The image of who you think you are supposed to become on this path. At first, Dhikr is approached with clear expectations. The seeker wants peace, clarity, emotional stability, spiritual depth, or a sense of closeness. These are natural starting points. But as practice continues, especially through consistent remembrance, Ibn Arabi would point out that another layer begins to form quietly in the background. The seeker starts building an internal identity of the spiritual person I am becoming. This is extremely subtle because it does not feel like ego in the obvious sense. It feels like progress. It feels like growth. It feels like discipline. But underneath it, there is still a structure of self-image being reinforced. The mind begins to track improvement. The heart begins to compare states. And slowly, even spiritual practice becomes another way of defining me. Ibn Arabi would not reject this phase, but he would reveal its hidden limitation. Any identity, even a spiritual one, is still a form, and forms are constantly changing. When you attach to any form, even refined inner states, you are still living within fluctuation. This is why seekers can experience moments of deep clarity during dhikr and still fall back into frustration afterward, because they are unconsciously trying to hold on to a state rather than understand what is beyond all states. As remembrance continues, something begins to disrupt this pattern. Not suddenly, but gradually. The seeker starts noticing that spiritual states come and go just like ordinary thoughts. Some days remembrance feels deep and effortless. Other days it feels heavy, distracted, or mechanical. Initially, this creates confusion. The mind asks, why am I not consistent? Why am I not progressing steadily? But Ibn Arabi would redirect this question. He would suggest that inconsistency is not a flaw in the path. It is the path revealing something deeper about reality itself. Everything in the human experience is subject to change, including inner states that feel spiritual. If even clarity and peace are temporary, then attaching identity to them becomes unstable. This realization begins to soften the seeker's grip. Not through force, but through repeated observation. You begin to see that even your best spiritual moments are not something you can permanently own. They appear, they are experienced, and then they pass, just like thoughts, just like emotions, just like everything else. At this stage, dhikr starts to reveal something very important. It is not here to give you a new identity. It is here to dissolve the need for one. Because identity, even spiritual identity, requires comparison. It requires memory. It requires measurement. And remembrance, in its deeper form, begins to pull awareness out of measurement entirely. The seeker may still continue practicing with effort, but something internal begins to shift. The question slowly changes from "how good am I doing?" to a quieter recognition, "who is it that is even measuring this?" And when that question becomes felt rather than intellectual, a different kind of awareness begins to emerge. Ibn Arabi would describe this as the weakening of attachment to spiritual narration. The mind constantly narrates experience. I am improving, I am distracted, I am focused, I am failing, I am progressing. But through sustained dhikr, this narration begins to lose authority, not because thoughts stop, but because they are no longer fully believed as identity. Instead of being the subject of every experience, awareness begins to rest slightly behind experience. There is still thinking, still feeling, still reacting, but something in you is less convinced that all of it defines who you are. This creates a quiet space where experience is simply experienced, without immediate interpretation. In this space, a very important transformation begins to unfold. The seeker starts to realize that even the idea of progress is part of the mind's structure. Progress assumes a direction, a goal, a comparison between where you are and where you should be. But Ibn Arabi's perspective points toward something deeper than progression. It points toward unveiling. Unveiling is not about becoming something better. It is about seeing more clearly what was already present, but unnoticed. This is why Dhikr, in its deeper sense, is not accumulation. It is removal, not addition of spiritual identity, but dissolution of unnecessary layers of identification. As this understanding deepens, the seeker may experience a strange shift. They may still continue practicing, still maintain discipline, still engage in remembrance, but the emotional investment in outcomes begins to soften. There is less obsession with how good the practice feels. There is more acceptance of whatever state arises. This does not mean indifference. It means stability. A quiet recognition that your practice is not defined by temporary experiences. Some days feel open, some feel closed, but neither defines the truth of what is being cultivated underneath. Ibn Arabi would say that at this point, the heart begins to free itself from spiritual ambition. And this is a very important stage, because ambition, even spiritual ambition, keeps the seeker subtly tied to outcome. When ambition loosens, presence becomes more direct. You begin to notice that awareness itself does not need improvement. It is already present in every state, whether clarity or confusion. What changes is not awareness, but your relationship with what appears within it. And in that recognition, something very quiet but profound stabilizes. Dhikr is no longer something you do to become someone. It becomes something that gradually reveals that there was never a separate someone needing to become anything in the first place. In Ibn Arabi's perspective, the seeker eventually arrives at a point where all the earlier struggles with distraction, identity, and spiritual ambition begin to settle into a deeper and quieter understanding. This is not the end of dhikr, and it is not a final achievement. It is something more subtle, the realization that remembrance was never separate from reality itself. At this stage, the seeker no longer experiences dhikr as something that needs constant effort to initiate. The earlier phases were marked by struggle, repetition, resistance, and gradual refinement. But now, something different begins to appear. Remembrance starts to feel less like an activity and more like a return to what was always present underneath every experience. Ibn Arabi would describe this as the removal of the illusion of separation between the one who remembers and the one who is remembered. At the beginning of the path, there is a clear sense of duality. I am remembering. There is a subject performing an action directed towards something higher or deeper. But as awareness matures, even this structure begins to soften. What remains is not a disappearance of awareness, but a simplification of it. The layers of internal narration begin to fall away. The constant commentary about progress, failure, improvement, and state begins to lose importance. The seeker is no longer constantly interpreting their experience. Instead, experience is simply being witnessed as it unfolds. This is where Ibn Arabi's teaching becomes deeply subtle. He does not describe this as the seeker reaching God as something distant. Rather, he points toward the realization that what was being sought was never absent in the first place. The sense of distance was created by layers of attention being directed outward, away from the immediacy of awareness itself. Now, through sustained remembrance, those layers have been gradually reduced, not by force, but by consistent return. And in that return, something becomes obvious that was previously overlooked. Awareness itself has always been here, unchanged, continuous, and present in every state of experience. At this point, Dhikr is no longer experienced as a separate practice standing apart from life. It becomes indistinguishable from the simple act of being aware. Whether the seeker is speaking, walking, thinking, or sitting in silence, there is a quiet continuity underneath all activity, not as a thought, but as a felt reality. Importantly, Ibn Arabi would warn that this is not a permanent fixed state in the way the mind expects. There is no final point where everything becomes static and unchanging. Rather, there is a growing stability of understanding that no state is permanent, yet nothing essential is ever lost. This removes one of the deepest anxieties on the path, the fear of losing progress. In earlier stages, the seeker constantly measures their condition. Am I improving? Am I regressing? Was yesterday better than today? But here, that measurement itself begins to feel unnecessary, because what is being discovered is not something that comes and goes, but the awareness in which all coming and going is witnessed. In this realization, even spiritual highs and lows lose their absolute meaning. A moment of clarity is seen as just a moment. A moment of confusion is also just a moment. Neither defines the totality of what is present. This equalization of experience is a major shift in perception. Ibn Arabi would describe this as the stabilization of witnessing without attachment. The seeker still experiences life fully, sometimes intensely, sometimes quietly, but the inner center is no longer fully dependent on the content of experience. There is a subtle independence from fluctuation. At this stage, something very important becomes clear. The purpose of Dhikr was never to create a special spiritual identity or to reach a permanent altered state. It was to remove the habitual forgetting that made awareness seem fragmented. And once that forgetting is significantly reduced, what remains is simplicity itself. The seeker begins to recognize that awareness does not need to be constructed. It does not need to be achieved. It is not the result of effort. It is what makes effort, thought, and experience even possible in the first place. And this recognition brings a profound sense of ease, not emotional excitement, not dramatic realization, but ease, a quiet reduction of inner tension, the feeling that nothing essential is missing, even when everything is changing. Life continues with its natural movement, but the internal resistance to that movement becomes weaker. In Ibn Arabi's language, this is where the heart becomes a clearer mirror, not because it has reached a final perfection, but because it is no longer constantly distorting reality through excessive identification. It reflects what is, without unnecessary interference. And so, what began as a secret dhikr aimed at opening the heart in 21 days reveals itself as something far deeper than a timeline or a technique. The real opening is not a sudden event. It is the gradual removal of the illusion that the heart was ever closed. In the end, there is no arrival in the way the ego expects. There is only the recognition that awareness has always been here. Remembrance has always been unfolding, and what you were searching for was never separate from the very act of searching itself. In Ibn Arabi's perspective, nothing in this path was ever about reaching something new. Every layer of struggle, every moment of clarity, every return from distraction was not taking you somewhere else, but stripping away the false distance you believed existed between you and what is real. Dhikr was never a tool to manufacture presence. It was a mirror being polished through repetition, patience, and surrender, until what was always there could no longer be ignored. The heart was never actually closed. It only appeared so under the weight of distraction, identity, and constant mental narration. When remembrance deepens, what dissolves is not the world, and not even the self in the way people fear, but the illusion that you are ever separate from awareness itself. What remains is not a dramatic transformation, but something far more difficult to describe and far more stable to live from. A quiet recognition that nothing essential was ever missing. And so the real ending of this journey is not an arrival, not an achievement, and not a final state. It is the end of searching for something that was never absent.